Hello and welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Rounds series. My name is Joe Caramelli. I oversee Grand Rounds for our department. So a couple of things about the Grand Round series before I introduce today's speaker. First, I encourage you to write comments or questions during the presentation into the Q&A or the chat, and I can go through those at the end with the presenter. There's a group of us that works on Grand Rounds each week, including Mike Walker and Samhara Braha. And we do record and archive most presentations, which are on the department and the Grand Rounds websites. This year's series, this academic year series, has funding from the Ripley Fund and from the Garvey Institute for Brain Health Solutions. And close to the end of the presentation, I'll put a link for a brief evaluation in the chat. That's just a couple of questions that's helpful for me in planning Grand Rounds. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about today's presenter. And today, the Grand Rounds presenter is Dr. Tiffany Farshoni. And Dr. Farshoni is the current director of psychiatry in the Office of Neuroscience at FDA and has been in this role for about the last 4 years or so. Previously, Dr. Farshoni worked, I think, for almost 10 years or so, initially as a medical officer and then as deputy director in the Division of Psychiatry Products in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. So it's about 14 or 15 years experience at FDA, working on the oversight of new drug review for all psychiatric drug development activities conducted under IND and review of new drug applications. I'm wondering how does one get into a career at FDA? And I think just from a little bit of review, it looks like in Dr. Farshoni's case, there was an early career in academics, first as a psychiatry resident and then child psychiatry fellow at Pittsburgh at the Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic, followed by research training and a T32 funded fellowship working on the constellation of symptoms such as irritability and bipolar disorder symptoms in youth. Now today we'll hear about work at the FDA. We're very fortunate to learn about Dr. Farshoni's work there and a summary of drug approval processes. So I'll stop sharing and turn it over to Dr. Farshoni.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just go ahead and share my slides then. Over here, PowerPoint. All right, we're all good? You're seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. All righty, so let me just maximize this here. Great, so as I already stated, my name is Tiffany Farshoni, and I'm the director of the Division of Psychiatry at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what exactly the FDA actually does and how we do it. You know, everybody seems to know that the FDA is a government agency, that we're in charge of approving new drugs, but most folks outside of the world of drug development have very little understanding of what's actually involved in that process. So today, my job is going to be to shed some light on that for you guys. To start, I just have the standard FDA disclaimer, and like most feds, I have no financial interest to disclose. We're kind of not allowed to have any. All right, so today I'm going to start with a really quick introduction of who I am and how I got to FDA. Then I'll talk briefly about how the FDA came to be and some of the legislation behind our main regulatory authorities, and an overview of how we're organized. After that, I'll talk a little bit about our oversight of clinical studies during drug development and how we evaluate the clinical study data to determine whether the benefits of a drug outweigh the risks. And I'll wrap up by talking about where you can find FDA resources and how you can be part of the process. So I figured I should start a little bit with my own introduction. You know, you kind of got a little bit of a preview, but because, you know, the chances are is that you've never met anyone who actually works at FDA before. And it's not exactly one of the well-defined career paths presented to you in medical school or residency. I know that I certainly never thought about it. In fact, I had a plan. To borrow a metaphor from my old department chair, David Kupfer, I knew exactly what my t-shirt would say. The idea is that you should be able to describe yourself or your research interests succinctly enough that it could fit on the front of a t-shirt. And mine was going to say that I was a physician scientist with expertise in pediatric mood disorders and functional neuroimaging. And I was totally 100% absolutely sure, no doubt about it. So I started off on the usual path. I picked a residency program with a strong research track. I had I had several mentors, David Axelson and Boris Bermaher for pediatric bipolar disorder, Mary Phillips for neuroimaging. You know, I had a good crew. I made sure that I had protected time, went into a T32 funded postdoc, applied for foundation funding, got it, started collecting pilot data for my K. And then from there, I was going to apply for my K award, get an R01 and become a principal investigator. You know, so like I said, you know, this is the usual path, and it might be well established, but it is one heck of an uphill slog. And to be honest, I was absolutely miserable. So fortunately for me, at one point when I was in this whole process, I happened to run into an old friend from medical school at the ACAP conference one year. And he had just started a job at FDA, told me that he thought I would really love it there. I kind of blew him off at the time because like I was in the middle of all of this. But once I realized that I didn't like writing grants and I didn't like writing papers, kind of makes it hard to be a PI. That's when I decided I didn't want to write my K. And I remembered that conversation and I gave him a call and I interviewed a few weeks later and the rest is history. So that's my history. So now I want to shift gears to the agency's history and start by going back to the very, very beginning. So although FDA is currently part of the Department of Health and Human Services, we actually started off as the Division of Chemistry within the Department of Agriculture. And the Division of Chemistry began investigating the adulteration of agricultural commodities as early as 1867. That was around the same time muckraking journalists were exposing the hazards of the marketplace, both in terms of adulterated foods and quack medicines. You know, around that time, things came to a head with, you probably all remember this from, you know, history classes about, you know, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that came out in 1906, documenting the horrors of the meatpacking industry. So after that, Congress actually took action, which was something they used to do occasionally, and they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. So the act prohibited the interstate transport of unlawful food and drugs under the penalty of seizure of the questionable products and prosecution of the responsible parties. So the now Bureau of Chemistry was in charge of administering the act. So under the act, drugs were now defined in accordance with standards of strength, quality, purity, and they were listed in the US Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary. And they couldn't be sold in any other condition unless the specific variations from the applicable standards were plainly stated in the label. Foods didn't have a similar set of standards, but the law at least prohibited the addition of any ingredients that would substitute for the food, that would conceal damage, pose a health hazard, or constitute a filthy or decomposed substance. So, and it tells you things were pretty bad if they had to like make a new law to make sure you weren't getting decomposed food, which is kind of disgusting. Anyways, so even though the Pure Food and Drug Act required that the drugs meet certain standards, those standards at the time had nothing to do with safety or with efficacy. There were still a lot of worthless cures floating around out there. And it took a massive tragedy to begin to change that. So in 1937, the S.E. Massengill Company began marketing elixir sulfanilamide. It was an oral liquid antibiotic that was created using diethylene glycol as a solvent. And it ended up killing about 100 people, including a bunch of kids. Whoops, there we go. So once again, Congress responded to public outrage and they passed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C, which required companies to perform animal safety tests on their proposed new drugs and to submit the data to FDA before being allowed to market their product. So now we can regulate safety. But it took another tragedy before we got the authority to evaluate efficacy as part of the drug approval process. I'm sure you all know the thalidomide story. Thalidomide was marketed in Europe and Canada as a treatment for anxiety, trouble sleeping, tension, and morning sickness. But in the United States, a junior reviewer at the FDA in one of her first assignments blocked its approval. Frances Kelsey was concerned about an English study that linked thalidomide to peripheral neuritis, and she kept asking the manufacturer to explain the finding. She also asked them for data showing that the drug would not be harmful to a fetus. So remember, at this point, safety was our only leverage. But in the meantime, while we were waiting for the data that Dr. Kelsey was asking for, the drug started to get linked to birth defects, and it was eventually pulled from all markets. So the thalidomide tragedy prompted tougher rules for testing and licensing of drugs. And here in the US, those rules were codified in the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the FD&C. The new regulations strengthened FDA, among other ways, by requiring applicants to prove efficacy and to disclose all side effects that were encountered in testing. The standard outlined in the amendment required manufacturers to establish a drug's effectiveness by substantial evidence. And substantial evidence was defined as evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations, plural. That's important. We'll come back to this a little bit later. In the meantime, Frances Kelsey was awarded the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. And ever since, FDA has been responsible for evaluating both safety and efficacy of new drugs. So fast forward a few decades, and now lots of additional legislation, and this is what FDA looks like today. We now have authority over not just food and drugs, but also biologics, medical devices, tobacco, veterinary medicine. But today I'm just going to focus on drugs and what we do in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER for short. CDER is organized into several offices. We're in the Office of New Drugs, but there are also offices overseeing generic drugs, pharmaceutical quality, surveillance and epidemiology, and more. Office of New Drugs is then further divided into smaller offices based loosely on body system. My group is part of the Office of Neuroscience, which includes the Division of Anesthesiology, Addiction, and Pain Medicine, 2 neurology divisions, and the Division of Psychiatry, or DP for short. DP is responsible for all of psychiatry. This includes the obvious indications like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, but we also review applications for behavioral manifestations of certain diseases. So for example, treatments for Alzheimer's disease are reviewed by the Division of Neurology 1, but we get the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So things like agitation, aggression, psychosis. So I'm going to delve into the nitty-gritty of the drug review process in a minute. But before I talk about what we do at FDA, I want to talk a little bit about what we don't do, okay? Because there are a lot of misconceptions out there. And to illustrate it, I'm going to quickly walk through a very recent example from one of the final episodes of the TV show, New Amsterdam. Now, I think that we can all acknowledge that medical dramas can sometimes strain credulity. I honestly, I can still remember watching one of the first episodes of Grey's Anatomy when the world-renowned cardiothoracic surgeon scrubbed in on an appendectomy. Like, seriously? Or like when the surgery interns would show up at the hospital in broad daylight. Like, no, that's not actually how it works. So for me, like the same way that any of us would feel watching surgery interns roll in the daylight, that's what this felt like for me watching this particular episode. It was so cringeworthy. All right, so the storyline kicks off with Dr. Max Goodwin announcing New Amsterdam's partnership with a pharmaceutical company and the results of their clinical study that found a cure for bulky large cell lymphoma. But of course, we need some drama. So enter Dr. Elizabeth Wilder, with Max's colleague and current love interest. Now, Max can tell that something is wrong. Wilder tells him that the trial is a sham. And she goes on to explain that even though the drug cured 89% of the patients in the trial, the study population was all ages 35 to 65, 89% Caucasian. So she's worried that without testing on a more diverse population, they can't be sure that the drug is safe for folks who aren't white. She doesn't want this to be the next thalidomide. Now, Max has to explain to Wilder's ASL interpreter and conveniently to the audience that thalidomide is a drug from the 60s that they gave to pregnant women for nausea, but we didn't know it would cause birth defects because no one tested it in pregnant women. And they decide that they can't release the data from the trial and they're going to kill the cure for cancer. So Max and Wilder confront the perennial medical drama bad guys, Big Pharma, and the hospital administrator. Pharma guy says that demographics don't matter because the drug targets a specific genetic defect. The administrator is incredulous. She says it may not have been tested on all of mankind, but there's irrefutable proof that it saves lives. Some lives. So Max responds by saying, I don't want to own a trial that says whites only. All right, now comes the big twist. Pharma guy says, these were your parameters. Wait, what? So Max and Wilder figure out that Dr. Sharp, Max's previous love interest, set the parameters for the trial so that Max could be part of the study a few seasons ago when he had cancer. So now they hatch a plan. They tell Pharma guy that they're going to submit the data, but they're also going to immediately start a new trial enrolling more diverse participants. They acknowledge that the inequities are on them, but tell Pharma guy that his company is going to profit, so they will be funding the study. Pharma guy obviously balks. He says, we bring drugs to market to make money, not hemorrhage it. They say, well, if you don't fund the trial, we'll bury the results and no one gets the drug. Pharma guy relents. They have a deal. And as a bonus, the whole experience reinforces to Max and Wilder that they're perfect for each other. So everybody lives happily ever after. Except for me, because I'm at home yelling at my TV because of how completely inaccurate the entire storyline was from start to finish. So it's hard to know exactly where to begin with everything that was wrong with this episode. But to start, drug companies, not the individual study sites, set the inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies. We review the protocol before the study is even started. If we saw inappropriately narrow inclusion criterion, we would tell the company that they need to fix that to improve generalizability of the study results or to provide a reasonable justification why not. We use animal data to give us information about potential fetal malformations. A better, but possibly less dramatic example of the importance of diversity in clinical trials might be something like zolpidem, where the recommended dose for women is half that of the recommended dose for men. And we didn't figure that out until after the drug was on the market because the clinical studies were about 80% male. The drug company owns the data. A study site doesn't get to bury it. Oops. If the drug was approved despite the lack of trial diversity, we can still require post-marketing studies if we think that there might be a safety concern. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. I could literally populate the entire multiverse with alternative storylines addressing the various inaccuracies here. But instead, I'll start by just walking you through what we actually do. So this is an overview of the drug development timeline. Companies developing a drug for clinical use, they start with basic research and animal studies. Once they're ready to start studies in humans in the US, they submit their investigational new drug application, or IND, to request permission from the FDA to conduct the clinical study. At that point, we have 30 days to review the protocol and determine whether it's safe to proceed. During that time, the company cannot actually start the trial. We have to review it first and make that determination before they can begin. After that, the company has to send us, they have to send us the protocols for every study before they begin, but they no longer have to wait the 30 days for us to review it. So we have to make sure that we're paying attention and we review those studies quickly because they can start as soon as they submit the protocol. However, if they want the study to serve as one of the adequate and well-controlled investigations necessary to demonstrate efficacy, the chances are that they have probably already asked our advice about the study design before submitting the protocol. They'll probably wait a few weeks to see if we have any additional advice after the review, which we frequently do. There's a lot of back and forth engagement between companies and FDA during drug development. So once the clinical studies are done and the company feels that they can demonstrate both safety and efficacy, then they submit their new drug application, or NDA. The application goes on a clock and we have to make a decision within 6 to 12 months. That clock depends on the type of application and the potential for a drug to address an unmet medical need. So a brand new drug gets a longer clock, than a new indication for an old drug, for example. And if something can address an unmet need, it gets a shorter priority clock. So at the end of all of this, if we determine that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks, the medication gets approved. So that was sort of the 30,000-foot view. Now, if we take a closer look, let's start with the review team. So every application that we get is reviewed by a large multidisciplinary team. We have a regulatory project manager who coordinates the review process and communicates with the company that is sponsoring it, or we just call them the sponsor. Our CMC team evaluates the drug substance and its synthesis. They also evaluate the dosage form, strength, excipients, impurities, and and the stability of the drug over time. Our Pharm Tox team reviews all the preclinical studies, including, for example, the animal toxicology studies. They let us know the target organs for toxicity, the safety margins to the proposed human dose. Clinical pharmacology will evaluate the drug's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. They also evaluate drug-drug interaction studies and studies evaluating the impact of organ impairment on PK parameters. The clinical reviewer evaluates the study protocol itself. So everything from the inclusion and exclusion criteria to the proposed dosage, the duration of treatment, safety monitoring, the endpoints, everything. The stats team will get involved at the IND stage if it appears that the study is intended to serve as an adequate and well-controlled study. Sometimes we have consultants involved for specific issues, like we get the clinical outcome assessments team to review novel study endpoints, or folks from the controlled substances staff will weigh in on abuse liability. And then there's me. I provide oversight of the entire process. I try to make sure that we're giving similar advice across similar programs, help the team think through difficult questions or reach consensus when there's a difference of opinion, and so on. And we do this for every clinical protocol throughout the development process until finally the studies are completed and the company files their new drug application. Then the whole team gets together again and reviews all of the results. But we'll get there. So what does a typical day look like for an FDA reviewer? I mean, to start with, it's a desk job. We're still mostly working at home, although now we're supposed to go in once a week. The work itself involves lots of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of thinking. We have a lot of meetings, but I almost never think that a meeting could have been an email, which is refreshing. When the review team gets together for a meeting, it's always productive and collaborative. You know, they're very goal-oriented. We do have congressionally mandated deadlines for most of the work that we do, so sometimes that can be a little bit stressful. But there's always something new. So that part is really super exciting. And basically, I kind of describe it as all of the fun parts about research without having to write any grants, and you don't have to run any of the studies yourself. So for me, it's completely like the dream job. Anyways, getting back to the work itself. What do we do with all of the data, right? So when we're reviewing a new drug application, we consider the treatment indication, available treatment options, the evidence for effectiveness and safety of the proposed new drug. And if the drug is assessed to be effective and if the safety concerns can be adequately managed, then we say there's a favorable benefit risk balance, and that supports a marketing approval. So to support an application, a company has to provide substantial evidence of effectiveness for the drug. This is the standard that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that was established by the Kefauver-Harris amendments, which said that drug manufacturers are required to establish effectiveness by substantial evidence, and that substantial evidence is defined as evidence from adequate and well-controlled investigations. So because of that plural, the standard has been interpreted to mean at least 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. But there's some flexibility in the standard. So like, for instance, it's going to be really difficult to do 2 large, adequate, and well-controlled studies in a rare disease population. So that's the kind of circumstance where we have that flexibility. Luckily, we have a guidance document that outlines our standards and provides examples of the types of situations in which we might accept something other than 2 studies. By the way, at this point, I do want to mention that we regularly publish guidance documents to help facilitate drug development. The last thing that we want is for drug companies to be flying blind. They need to know what our expectations are so that they can design their trials in a way that will yield interpretable, meaningful, usable data at the end of the day. So if you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that I've mentioned this concept of adequate and well-controlled trials a few times, 6 actually, but who's counting? The features of an adequate and well-controlled study are actually listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, but I've laid out a few of the key criteria here. So the study has to use a design that permits a valid comparison with a control to provide a quantitative assessment of the drug effect. Typically, but not always, this means placebo control. Adequate and well-controlled, adequate measures are taken to minimize bias on the part of the subjects, the observers, and the analysts of the data. So for example, this is where blinding the trial comes into play. The methods of assessment have to be well-defined and reliable. So, you can't just take a patient and say, are you feeling better, and tally up the proportion of yes answers in each group. You have to have a proper assessment of what you're trying to treat. So let's say a company has completed at least 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, and they have positive results, and they think the safety profile of their drug is favorable. At that point, they submit their new drug application, and we begin our review. And all those team members that I mentioned earlier are involved at this stage as well. But now they're reviewing the results of all the studies and coming up with an integrated assessment of benefits and risks of the drug. And like I said, if the benefits outweigh the potential risks, then we can approve the drug. So I think the easiest way to talk about what we do when we're reviewing a new drug may be to frame that discussion in the drug label. And for illustrative purposes, this is the table of contents from one of our most recently approved drugs. If you didn't know, the standard format for all drug labels was revised in 2006 with the physician's labeling rule. And at this point, every drug approved since 2006 is in this format. And a good chunk of our older drugs have actually had their labels converted as well. So if you're looking for the indications and usage, that's always right up in section 1. If you want to know about pediatric use, that's in 8.4. A description of clinical studies that supported approval is in section 14, and so on. So going back to the members of the review team and how their work informs the prescribing information, the findings from the CMC reviewer are reflected in sections 3, 11, and 16. This is where you'll find what the drug is, what kind of excipients are in the drug product, what it looks like, how you store it, etc. The non-clinical team evaluates the animal studies that inform parts of section 8, the receptor occupancy studies that inform 12.1, and all of the data that goes into 13. Clinical pharmacology review informs our recommendations for dose adjustment based on intrinsic and extrinsic factors. ClinPharm also evaluates the drug-drug interactions, pharmacodynamics, and pharmacokinetics. The clinical and statistical teams evaluate and review the clinical studies together. So not only have we reviewed the studies before they started and provided oversight during the studies, for example, by reviewing adverse event reports, now we get the subject level raw data. We rerun the company's analyses to make sure that we get the same results. We perform our own exploratory and sensitivity analyses. The company will send us a draft label with their submission, but we usually provide substantial edits. Ultimately, we write the description of the trial design, endpoints, and results in section 14. The population in the studies and the assessments will inform the indications and usage section. Typically, the dosage and administration instructions will mirror the way the drug was administered in the clinical studies. And finally, we get the raw data from the adverse event reports. And so we audit that data to make sure that adverse events are appropriately characterized and grouped for analyses. And we do our own analyses of the data to inform sections 4, 5, and 6 of the label, plus any box warning if needed. Now, and I really want to drive this point home because what we do is not peer review. Did the drug companies send us their study reports with all their analyses? Sure. Do we take that at face value? Absolutely not. We get the raw data, we do our own analyses, we verify, we dig, we look at the application from all angles. Then on top of that, even once we're done, we have another team that then goes on to review the label itself when we're done with it, to look for any language that might be promotional, which we then edit further. So nothing makes it into this label unless we have confirmed its accuracy. Now, sometimes we might approve a drug, but still have some unanswered questions. And we can ask for additional studies. Typically, those are negotiated with the company and agreed to in advance, and those are called post-marketing commitments. But in certain circumstances, we have the authority to require additional studies. So, for example, the Food and Drug Administration's Amendments Act, or FDA, allows us to assess a known serious risk related to the use of a drug, or signals of a serious risk related to the use of a drug, or to identify an unexpected serious risk when available data indicate the potential for a serious risk. I wanted to specifically read those because the language is a little wonky, but basically it means that we can require studies if we have a concern about safety. In addition to that, we also have the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, which gives us the authority to require pediatric studies as well. One more circumstance in which we can require studies is when a drug is approved via an accelerated approval pathway. So this pathway allows for earlier approvals of drugs that treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need. But instead of already having direct clinical evidence of a benefit, that approval is based on a surrogate endpoint. A surrogate endpoint is a marker like a laboratory measurement, radiographic image, physical sign, or another measure that is thought to predict clinical benefit, but is not itself a measure of clinical benefit. And so the use of a surrogate can considerably shorten the time required prior to receiving FDA approval. Now, we don't have any of these in psychiatry, and until we get a better understanding of the biological underpinnings of our diseases, I don't really foresee a lot of that happening in the near future, but just to bear it in mind, I think that this is one pathway that we have, and one pathway where we can require additional studies afterwards. So it's important to know that our review doesn't end when the drug is approved. Obviously, we can't possibly identify every potential safety signal based on the pre-marketing studies. We have a vigilant pre-marketing review. Active post-marketing surveillance is still essential. When we have an entire office dedicated to safety and epidemiology, we have divisions dedicated to pharmacovigilance. The pre-marketing studies are usually only involve several hundred to several thousand patients. So we maintain a system of post-marketing surveillance and risk assessment programs to identify adverse events that didn't approve during the drug approval process. And we use this information to update drug labeling, and on rare occasions, we can even reevaluate the approval or marketing decision. So now that I've given you the sort of whirlwind tour of what we do, I want to point you to some resources where you can find out more. So the first one that I want to send you to is the Drugs at FDA database. So, people think that we're mysterious and this, that we're our own black box, but we're actually really transparent if you know where to look for information. So this is one of the first examples. So from here, you can look up the label of any approved drug. And, I realize that in itself might not be super exciting, and you're probably thinking you can just Google the drug name and get the label. But fun fact, the search engine algorithms don't always take you to the most recent version of the label. So if we've added new safety information or approved a new indication, you might not see that if you rely on Google. Here, you can go directly to the source. And as a bonus, not only can you find the most recent label, the site also links to older versions of the label, approval letters, and the actual FDA review documents. Now, I don't really imagine that most people want to read, 200 or 300 pages dissecting every aspect of a drug development program. But if you're curious, it's there, and you can see that for yourself. Sometimes during our review of a new drug, we seek advice from a committee of external experts. When we do that, all of the meeting materials get posted online. So the background materials posted for the meeting is usually quite a bit shorter than the full review. And the backgrounders from both FDA and the drug companies are posted ahead of the meeting, and the committee meetings can be viewed live via webcast or when the recording is posted online after the meeting. If the drug in question is one that we don't actually end up approving, this is the only source of public information about our take on that application. Because if we don't approve a drug, we send a letter to the company outlining why and what they can do to give us information we would need in order for them to get to an approval. So it's like a weird convoluted legalese kind of thing, but it's not considered a final action because there's still something the company can do to get to approval. So the letter, we have approval letters and then we have complete response letters. So that complete response letter, though, doesn't get made public unless the company chooses to release it, and most of them don't. But if the application was discussed at an advisory committee, you still have a way to get some insight into our decision making. And as a side note, we actually have an advisory committee meeting coming up next week on Friday for psychiatry. I mentioned earlier that we're responsible for the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So this advisory committee meeting that's coming up next week is for brexpiprazole, for agitation associated with Alzheimer's dementia. So that it's a full day event. It's available online to watch. The materials, the backgrounder, I think, is getting posted early next week. The slides will be available ahead of time. After I get off of this call, I have to go and clear the slides so that they can be posted. So that's something that you can watch if you're interested in that. All right. So although you wouldn't know it from the New Amsterdam storyline, we've actually been paying attention to clinical trial diversity for at least a few years now. So beginning in 2015, we actually started publishing what are called snapshots for all approved new molecular entities. So that's any drug that hasn't been previously approved in any other form. Now on this site, we have a searchable database of all the new molecular entities approved since 2015. The snapshot includes a breakdown of the study by results by age, race, gender, along with a very brief lay summary of the benefits and risks of the drug. In addition to this, actually, last year we published a guidance for industry so that they know what our expectations are for diversity plans for their studies. And there was just new legislation passed, I think in December, that actually is now going to require that companies have a diversity plan for drug development. So this is all moving in the right direction to make trials better and more generalizable. All right, now I keep mentioning these guidance documents. But this is probably most relevant for folks who are actually engaged in research and conducting clinical trials. This website is, it's a searchable site for guidance documents. They're all posted online. This is relatively easy to search, so it's a good resource. And then I also just want to take a moment to encourage all of you, if your patient is having an adverse event that, or adverse reaction rather, that you think is sort of unusual, that it's not in the label, you can actually report that to FDA. Our post-marketing pharmacovigilance efforts only work if people are actually reporting things. So, the more data that you can include in your report, the better. And don't be surprised if at some point someone from our pharmacovigilance team ends up contacting you to get additional information. When they're trying to evaluate a potential safety signal, they often dig into the individual reports and try to follow up to better understand the specific cases. All right. And finally, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't throw in a pitch for new reviewers. I really can't imagine a cooler job. I love what I do. And so if you enjoy research, study design, digging into data, all of that kind of stuff, if you're basically like me, a bit of a nerd, you also might think that this job is pretty darn cool. So if my presentation has piqued your curiosity at all, please feel free to send me your CV, a short cover letter, and just, let me know. We're definitely looking for people. So that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Very interesting, Dr. Farshani. Thank you for walking through this, describing your own experience, moving into working at FDA, the process that's involved. People actually have questions. There's been questions that have come in already. I'd encourage any other participants to write in questions. But before I get to participant questions, I did want to just clarify one thing. Earlier, you had mentioned about sometimes there can be a shorter priority clock if there's an urgent need. Is that the same as accelerated approval, or is that something different?
They're different. So accelerated approval is, like I mentioned, when you're approving something based on a surrogate endpoint, and then you have to do confirmatory studies afterwards. I think like the one that's been in the news the most recently is the Aduhelm, for Alzheimer's. So I realized that one, I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. That wasn't me. I didn't approve it. So that's somebody else's division. But it's still the idea that there was this, surrogate marker with the amyloid, and now they have to do the study in the post-marketing environment to show that, yes, that change in amyloid actually does translate eventually to a change in cognition. Whereas for a priority review on a shorter clock, it's just like, so an example of that was Spravato, which, it was for treatment-resistant depression. We gave it a priority clock because of the rapid acting nature of the drug. That one, because it was not a new molecular entity, because it was a single enantiomer of a drug that had already been approved. So that one we reviewed on a 6-month clock, which a 6-month clock with an advisory committee. And in the middle of all of that, we had the longest government shutdown in our nation's history. So that was really fun. I'm not post-traumatic about that one at all. But,
Oh, I see.
yeah. But so 6 months.
I see. Yeah, that's what that was.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But again, because of
Thank you for
potential to
differentiating
address
those.
unmet need. Yeah.
A question came in about what it might take to approve slow release oral morphine, which is already on the market for a new indication to treat opioid use disorder. This is maybe a different division.
Yeah.
It sounds like that's approved for that indication in Canada. What would it take new trials? Would it take something else? What might lead to an approval in the United States?
So, I mean, I'm not sure what the evidence base is that supported an approval in Canada. Like you said, that's part of a different division. So I'm not sure that I can respond to that, because I mean, I'm not even sure if the company that has gotten the approval in Canada is seeking the indication here. Also, I know that in our a lot of the stuff related to opioids is kind of a moving target with new legislation like the Support Act and things like that. And I know that basically every opioid has to go to an advisory committee now. Now they have to not only talk about the benefits and risks of the drug in, the patient by patient context, but they also have to provide information about the potential public health impact because of our ongoing opioid crisis. So their division has some extra layers of complication that I probably shouldn't speak to because I'm less familiar with them.
I see. Thank you. A question in clinical trials, there's data safety monitoring boards for, how does that fit into FDA review? Are DSMBs appointed by FDA, or do you review their minutes? Are they employed by FDA? Yeah, can you comment on that?
So we don't set up the monitoring board or anything like that, but we do review their charter during the IND phase. We do get their minutes. So if like something comes up and we're interested in a safety signal and we see adverse events, we're going to want to see like, okay, well, so what did the DSMB have to say about that particular issue or that particular subject? So yeah, so we do review them, but we're not, we don't set them up. That's something that, the company who's developing the drug will identify the members of the DSMB.
I see. This question is another question came in about similar medications to what's already approved, maybe for the same indication. Is there a thought to have requirement to develop new drugs, not necessarily new drugs, that's not the right term, new sort of targets, or maybe starting to make sort of the Me Too type drugs, maybe less common. I'm not sure how to best ask the question. The concern is about the sort of multiple types of medications doing the same.
Yeah. So we don't have the authority to require like superiority trials. We can only say, like, is the drug effective? Do its benefits outweigh the risks, for that given drug? There's no requirement for having a comparator, unless there are certain circumstances where, like a placebo is unethical in the trial. But for most cases, it's just a comparison drug versus placebo. So we don't really have that authority. But what we do have is, again, like those faster clocks are a huge motivator. So we do have programs like fast track designation or a breakthrough therapy designation that can encourage companies to go after those more impactful types of products. If somebody gets a breakthrough therapy designation, my understanding is that tends to be pretty good for their stock prices and things like that, because it's an early recognition that they have a product that could be meaningful in the marketplace. So it's not just a Me Too, it is addressing an unmet need, or it is addressing a serious condition. So that kind of, so we understand that, we need to be able to get really innovative medicines out there. And so those are the kinds of programs we have to try to encourage development in that space.
I mean, it's just perhaps obvious, but you can only review applications that come to you. You're not, so you're not, it's not the FDA determining what should be developed, really. It's approval of what's being submitted or not approval.
Right.
Is that an accurate way to think about it? Or
Yeah. We don't really go out and, solicit particular programs, but we just try to.
Was a question. I guess in my mind, I'm thinking about NIH, putting out announcements, respond to these. You're talking about grant writing. You're not putting out announcements, develop drugs in this area. That's not, as I understand. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But but again, not just things like like breakthrough therapy designation, but so for instance, like going after rare diseases. For the longest time, nobody was doing rare disease work because your patient population is so small that it's not going to really be that profitable. But once we started offering orphan designations and priority vouchers and things like that, that was something that really sped up drug development in that space. The one place where we do have legislation that allowed, so PREA, the Pediatric Research Equity Act. Actually, with pediatrics, it's sort of twofold. For years we just didn't get pediatric studies, and we all know that kids are not just little adults. Like, we know that. So we have the Best Pharmaceuticals in Children Act, which allows for additional exclusivity. If we ask a company for studies and they do them the way that we've specified, they can get an additional 6 months of pediatric exclusivity. If their product gets actually, whether or not the studies are positive, they can get that 6 months of exclusivity as long as they did them to a certain standard. And that's really valuable. And then we also have the ability to require those studies with the Pediatric Research Equity Act. So that's one space where we actually do have some teeth that we can say, like, look, this is something where we really want pediatric drug development. But to say that, gosh, we really need new things for depression, it really just depends on what companies are doing.
You commented on post-marketing surveillance and what can go in there, reporting adverse events. And I was wondering, is that the process that leads to a black box, or is it an alternate path, or are there many things that could lead to a black box on a label?
Yeah, well, okay, so here's another fun fact. So the actual name of it is not the black box. just a boxed warning. But everywhere
Oh,
people call it a black box, and it makes it sound like really ominous and terrible, but it is our most prominent warning, but it's not our most serious warning. Our most serious warning is obviously a contraindication, because that tells you that there's no circumstance in which you can use the drug. But in a box warning, it can be a safety signal that came up during the development program. So again, going back to the Spravato example, so esketamine, we also have brexanolone has a box that came out of the stuff that was in the development program. If you see something and you feel like in order for people to use this drug safely, they need to really be aware of this, that's what goes into the box. So, but the contrast of that is, with antipsychotics, we have a box warning for risk of death in the elderly and demented patients. For antidepressants, we have the suicidal ideation and behavior warnings. Those all came about because of things that were seen in post-marketing surveillance, and it really required large data sets, meta-analyses across different drugs in order to identify those signals. And those would have never been identified in the pre-marketing space, because they're just you really need the much bigger numbers in order to see those.
thank you. There's a couple of more questions. I encourage, if there's other questions, we do have a few minutes. One question came in. I'm not aware of this. Perhaps you can comment. Is there a financial relationship of any kind between pharmaceutical companies and FDA? Does FDA receive funding in some way? Can you comment?
So drug companies, when they submit their new drug application, they have to pay a user fee. So that is in exchange for that user fee, that is why we have clocks on our review process. So they and that funding is used for it's PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So it was passed through Congress at a time like back in the 80s when it could take 10 years for a non-priority drug to get approved. The backlog was massive, and we were well behind the rest of the world in terms of our review timelines. Now, we are required to meet those clocks at least 95% of the time. And the extra funding is intended for us to be able to hire enough people to accomplish those goals. So that's where the funding relationship comes in. It also helps our paychecks a little bit, because physicians at FDA make a little bit more than the general schedule that the rest of the federal government makes. It's still, we can barely compete with academia. We certainly can't compete with industry, but it does help with our salary. But there is that firewall there. Like there is no, it's not like a pay for play kind of thing. Like a drug company doesn't say, well, we, gave you $1 million for our drug review, so we demand approval. Like they're not allowed to do that. They don't have any say over how the money is spent. It's just an additional amount on top of our congressional appropriations.
I see.
Yes, they do help to pay our salaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think you actually, in that last question, you commented on the PDUFA and addressed that one. Is there another question came in? This is early on. Is there a pre-IND consultation, or are there preparatory consultation meetings with FDA? Where would one start or look for that?
Yeah. So that is an option. So again, there's a guidance there. We have a FDA meetings guidance that will tell folks exactly how to ask for that advice. But yeah, so oftentimes companies will come in, they'll ask for, it's a type B pre-IND meeting is what it's called technically. And it can come in and ask all sorts of questions about, are our animal studies adequate to support this study that we want to do? What do you think about this inclusion or exclusion criterion? We generally prefer if the questions are more specific and directed, not just like, is our design okay? Are our non-clinical, Because if it's something that's just going to be a matter of review when the protocol is submitted, it's not really worth a meeting. But yeah, so we get those all the time. A lot of times companies will try to squeeze questions about their entire development program into the pre-IND meeting. And we're just like, look, it's too early. We need data before we can answer your phase 3 question kind of thing. But yeah, now one thing that, at the academic level, sponsor investigators often don't realize that they can ask for that kind of a meeting too. And it's the same process, you go through the same channels. So if anybody's interested in that, just look up the guidance and that's something that you can ask for.
Thank you for that comment. And with one other question came in on a boxed warning. This may be the final question due to time. It's maybe a larger question, which is modifying boxed warnings as new information comes up. Specifically, the question is about suicidal ideation on antidepressant medication.
Yeah.
I mean, so
it is really extraordinarily difficult to change a box once it's on there. That one in particular, we've continued to collect safety information. It's difficult because once we identified the signal, then we started making sure that companies were evaluating suicidal ideation and behavior more systematically. The unfortunate effect of that, although it does allow for better identification of a signal and better tracking and everything, it means that now we basically have 2 different cohorts that can't really be compared to each other, because the old data was based on just adverse event reporting. The new data is based on actual semi-structured assessment. But now, once it's been recorded in an assessment, the companies aren't reporting it as an adverse event anymore. And so we're stuck comparing apples and oranges. And so we are looking at that data and constantly reevaluating it as new data comes in. But I think that I can say for a fact that if we were ever to consider changing that box warning for any reason, we would absolutely the kind of thing that we would take to an advisory committee meeting and make sure that we have public input and a great deal of transparency before we make any changes in something that major and impactful.
I appreciate your response and answer to that question. Well, Dr. Farshani, here we are just about 1 p.m. Pacific at the end of our hour here. And I want to thank you again for joining us to present today in our Grand Round series, for taking questions at the end. I think we've really benefited from your time and your presentation. And thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Here we go. Take care.